What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Wrestling Decoded, and today we're covering a specific type of rivalry that wrestling has returned to over and over again across every era of the business because nothing generates heat quite like watching two people who genuinely know each other, who traveled the same roads, shared the same locker rooms, maybe even the same bloodline, standing across the ring from each other with real contempt in their eyes. The brotherhood turned rivalry is wrestling's most reliable, emotional engine, and today we're going through the ones that actually delivered on that premise rather than just teasing it. Let's get into it. If you're into these deep dives into wrestling's most emotionally compelling storylines, that's exactly what this channel does. Go ahead and subscribe before we start. Let's establish first why this particular type of rivalry lands differently than a standard championship feud or a simple babyface versus heel program. A regular rivalry asks the audience to invest in two strangers competing. A brotherhood turned rivalry asks the audience to invest in the destruction of something they previously believed in. A partnership, a shared identity, a genuine bond that the audience themselves had emotional ownership of before it broke. That added layer of loss is what separates these stories from everything else wrestling tells, and it's why, when one of them is done right, it tends to produce the most visceral crowd reactions the business generates. Starting with the one that set the template for almost every other version that followed it, Bret Hart and Owen Hart at WrestleMania X and Beyond, 1994. The foundation of this story was so carefully built that most fans, watching it develop on television, didn't initially see it as a rivalry at all. They saw a younger brother trying to prove himself alongside an established star, genuinely frustrated by being positioned as the smaller, less celebrated name in the same family. Owen's promo work through late 1993 was a slow burn of resentment, articulated so clearly and specifically that it felt less like a wrestling angle and more like a real family dynamic playing out on television. The moment Owen superkicked Bret during their tag match at the 1994 Royal Rumble, betraying him mid-match for reasons that had been building for months of real, patient storytelling, is one of the cleanest single moments of character motivation in wrestling history. The audience understood exactly why it happened. That's genuinely rare. WrestleMania X gave them their singles match, an opener that most observers still rank among the finest matches WrestleMania has ever produced despite never headlining the card, and one that worked specifically because of the emotional backstory already established before a single move was thrown. Owen won clean. Bret won the title later the same night. The complexity of that structure, the younger brother getting the victory, but the older brother getting the championship, is exactly the kind of narrative nuance that great wrestling storytelling produces when it's working properly. Here's a question worth sitting with. If WrestleMania X had simply been two strangers in a technically similar match with identical in-ring quality, would it still be discussed the same way 30 years later? Moving forward to the most physically brutal version this specific type of story has ever been told. Shawn Michaels and Triple H, DX's internal collapse in 2002, a rivalry that operated differently from the Hart brothers story because both men's real-life relationship made the fiction genuinely difficult to separate from reality. Triple H and Shawn Michaels were legitimate best friends outside the ring, members of the same backstage group across the mid-90s, performers who by most accounts had a genuine bond that the audience had watched develop across years of television. When that relationship curdled into a feud, the intensity on screen had an authenticity behind it that manufactured storylines between strangers can rarely replicate. Their unsanctioned match at SummerSlam 2002, a match with no referee authority, no rules, and no disqualifications, was built around a simple, powerful premise. These two men know each other well enough to hurt each other efficiently, and they both know exactly where the other person's weaknesses are. The result was one of the most legitimately physical main event matches WWE produced in that entire era. The Bloodline saga, spanning from 2020 through its most recent chapter in 2024, is the most ambitious version of the brotherhood-turned-rivalry structure wrestling has ever attempted, specifically because it operated across multiple tiers simultaneously rather than as a single pairing. Roman Reigns versus the USOs, Roman versus Sami Zayn, Roman versus Cody Rhodes. Each of these could be examined as its own distinct story, but the thing that made the entire Bloodline era hold together as a unified piece of storytelling was the consistent use of loyalty and family as both the stated value system and the primary weapon. Roman didn't just compete against people, he converted them, tested their loyalty, and then ultimately punished them for failing that test. Quick pause here. Drop a comment on which specific chapter of the Bloodline storyline you think produced the single best individual television moment, because I think this is genuinely one of those debates where 10 different people will give you 10 different answers. The JUSO chapter sits at the emotional center of all of it because it lasted the longest at the closest range. Jay wasn't a stranger Roman had targeted. He was family, a cousin and tag team partner across years of television, someone who Roman genuinely seemed to trust within the fiction of the story, before that trust became the exact tool the character used to manipulate him. Jay's repeated vacillations between loyalty to Roman and loyalty to his brother Jimmy created the most sustained dramatic tension in the entire era, producing a run of television episodes in late 2020 through 2021 that most serious wrestling observers consider the best long-form character work WWE has produced since the peak Attitude Era. His eventual use no more moment, publicly rejecting Roman's leadership, landed with the weight it did specifically because the audience had watched 12 months of Jay being pushed toward that moment and pulling back from it over and over before finally committing. The most underrated version of this structure in wrestling history is almost certainly Eddie Guerrero versus Rey Mysterio from 2005, specifically because the framing of their rivalry deliberately weaponized the real friendship both men were known to have outside the ring. The storyline's central device, Eddie claiming to know a secret about Mysterio's son Dominic's biological parentage, threatening to reveal it as leverage in their feud, generated genuine discomfort in the audience rather than clean, conventional heat. Fans who loved both men found themselves unable to fully root against Eddie, even as he did increasingly heelish things, because the warmth of their real-world relationship kept bleeding through the performance. The SummerSlam 2005 ladder match, which settled the custody of Dominic in one of the stranger stipulations WWE has ever constructed, still holds up as genuinely great in-ring work delivered under deeply strange narrative circumstances. And the most recent significant example of this structure, Cody Rhodes versus Roman Reigns, building through 2023 and reaching its culmination at WrestleMania XL in 2024, is interesting specifically because it's the version of this story that operated on the widest possible stage with the most explicit mythological language around it. Cody's entire WrestleMania 40 journey was framed around family in a very specific way. His father, Dusty Rhodes, had never won the WWE Championship across a legendary career, and the title Cody was chasing was explicitly positioned as the completion of a family story rather than simply an individual achievement. Roman's response to that framing, using his own family mythology as the counterweight, turned what could have been a straightforward title match into something that felt genuinely loaded with real weight from multiple directions simultaneously. The connecting thread through all of these stories, the Hearts, DX's collapse, the Bloodline era, Eddie and Rey, Cody and Roman, is that none of them derive their emotional power primarily from in-ring work. The matches were great, in several cases genuinely all-time great. But the reason people still talk about them, the reason they register as something different from a standard championship program, is that all of them ask the audience to grieve something before celebrating anything. The Hart Brothers match at WrestleMania X worked because you'd watched the relationship break. The Bloodline worked because you'd watched Roman weaponize love. Eddie and Rey worked because you couldn't fully enjoy the villain being the villain. That's the specific alchemy this type of rivalry produces when it's done properly. It makes the audience feel the loss of the partnership before it lets them feel anything else. And that grief is what transforms a wrestling match into something that lingers well past the final bell. Which brotherhood turned rivalry do you think wrestling has done most effectively? Let me know your honest takedown in the comments. And if you want more of these deep dives into wrestling's most emotionally compelling storylines, make sure you're subscribed to Wrestling Decoded. There's plenty more of this still to uncover.